Welcome, and thank you for joining Philadelphia Magazine's ThinkFest 2021. I'm Bradford Pearson, contributing editor at Philadelphia Magazine, and our session today is Reimagining Philadelphia, the next new hotspots. Our speakers are Joe Forkin, president of the Delaware River Waterfront Corporation, and Greg Reaves and Leslie Smallwood-Lewis, founders and co-owners of Mosaic Development Partners. This session is sponsored by Penn Medicine, the birthplace of mRNA vaccines. The work of Penn Medicine researchers Dr. Catalin Carrico and Drew Weissman has saved countless lives from COVID-19 and will undoubtedly save countless more. Thank you to the rest of our sponsors for this event: Bank of America, St. Joseph's University, my alma mater, Western Governors University, and GoPuff. Please remember to join us for the rest of our sessions this week at noon and 4 p.m. And if you miss any of the sessions, we invite you to join us to see them at phillymag.com/thinkfest. Thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon. Here are our guests for Reimagining Philadelphia. If you all three want to introduce yourselves.
Sure. I'll start. Leslie Smallwood-Lewis, one of the principals of Mosaic Development Partners. Good afternoon.
I'm Greg Reaves, the other principal of Mosaic Development Partners.
And I'm Joe Forkin, the president of the Delaware River Waterfront Corporation.
So as the title of this session, Reimagining Philadelphia, portends, I want to talk a little bit today about some of the development projects that you're all working on. Specifically with Mosaic, I want to speak to the Navy Yard and Joe's work on sort of the east side of the city. So one of the big things in Philadelphia that I always think about is what Interstate 95 did to the city of Philadelphia. And the work along the Delaware and then the Navy Yard are both influenced pretty greatly by 95 sort of serving as this barrier to the rest of the city. So in your all's work, how do you see the work that you do? How do you tie that back to the city as a whole, considering that a lot of your work is physically divided by this gigantic road that runs through our city?
It's an excellent question. I'm going to defer to Greg because he's been really intimately involved in the master planning process that's going on at the Navy Yard, and that is something that's being heavily discussed. So
yes, and it's interesting because you talk about 95 creating a barrier, and it didn't only do it for Philadelphia, but if you look at the city of Chester as well, it created significant issues there. And I think part of the issue that we look at in terms of these barriers is what do they do to equity? And at the Navy Yard specifically, we see the equitable divide that was created by these massive transportation networks like I-95. The I-95 bridge essentially cuts through the entrance of the Navy Yard. And as we're reimagining the Navy Yard for a place that's equitable and available to people beyond the corporate business center that it's been for now the last number of years, and bringing residents in, a new community of workers, mixed income people, there's a really huge need for different modalities of comers, and those are bike, walk, public transportation, something other than a car. And the 95 bridge, the 95 connector is a significant barrier to creating a streamlined approach to that. And we've been working with a number of transportation designers along with our architects and PIDC, frankly, our team at Ensemble Mosaic, to really think about what is the new approach to make that now work. And it's incredibly complicated to have to think about it after the fact, after it's already been in place. It's incredibly costly. Even if you can find agreement, it might take up to 15 years to solve the problem once the agreement is found and agreed to and budgeted. So the problem with that thinking that we found is that if you haven't thought about all of the constituents in advance and the potential people that could be benefiting from a particular space, and then you make a major move like that, like a major roadway, such as 95, you really do have long-term consequences that are difficult to change. And that's what we're dealing with, I think, throughout the city along the 95 corridor, is not only do we have some good ideas that we've seen debated for years, the problem is now being able to change them and move them to a point where we can get the level of accessibility that we think we need to create really this great waterfront in the great city.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that, Greg, Leslie, and Brad. Sometimes I feel like my entire job is tackling I-95. You know, it runs the closest, at least in the center section of the waterfront that the DRWC thinks about. And I always say it's both a physical barrier, which is true, that cuts off equity, Greg, to your point, equity and access. And we view DRWC as a organization really thinking about access and how do we get this portion of the city reconnected integrally to the entire city. But then as importantly, it's a psychological barrier.
Yes.
People think they can't reach it, right? They think they can't get through it. Maybe there's not a good transit option that takes someone through it. So this psychological barrier then magnifies the physical issue of the highway that's there. So, I mean, just specifically from DRWC, when we were thinking about like our master plan, like our roadmap, how are we going to hopefully reconnect the waterfront to the city? And that was a really citizen-driven plan. So community outreach, public outreach, speaking to the entire city, and do you want to get here? What do you want to do when you get here? How do you access this space? One of the principles of that was how do you bridge over, get under, go around I-95 in some way, shape, or form. And we had great partners in helping us think about that. And it could be, for us at least, we want to start, right? So you want to show momentum. And even though this thing exists and it's probably not going to be buried and it's probably not going to go away in our lifetimes, are there simple interventions that start to change that psychological barrier? And so we have like a connector street program, which is simple interventions in a street that go under or over I-95 to say, hey, it's a pleasant experience. It's well lit. There's good artwork. This is a place in and of itself, and it leads to something even better. It leads to a park, or it leads to something like that. And then, Greg, to your point is, it can take years to get something done through the Department of Transportation with funding restrictions and, how that works through all the counties. Our approach is small victory, build upon another victory, build upon another victory until you get enough momentum moving forward where you have something like one of our crowning achievements, like Penn's Landing Park, which is going to bridge over an entire block of I-95 and reconnect the historic core back to the waterfront. But Brad, it is the overarching sort of infrastructure piece in the room that everyone is trying to solve for right now, I think, especially Mosaic and DRWC.
Yeah, well, that's, that was my thing when I was thinking about the work that you all do. What sort of ties that together? What connects that together? What are the impediments to the work that you're trying to do? And for me, when I was thinking about it, it's like, it's the interstate. And before I moved back to Philly, I lived in Dallas for 8 years. And Dallas is a city where all of Center City, Dallas is just ringed by highways. And you see what a detriment that has been to the connectivity of Center City. Center City was completely hollowed out in terms of housing up until, the last decade. So, and the city of Dallas and the state, and working with private partners, they ended up capping a canyoned highway. And the wonder that did to reconnect the northern part of Center City, downtown Dallas, with its outlying neighborhoods, it was instantaneous. As soon as that connection was made, there was more development on both sides of the park when they capped it. And then it became a central gathering place for the entire city. People came from all over the city to go to this park that was previously just airspace over a highway. So that's what I always think about, the work that folks like you all do, and how that sort of innovation can really change the way an average citizen consumes their own city that they might not have considered in the past.
And
I
it's
think that's,
interesting.
go ahead, Leslie.
No, I was just going to say one thing that that's kind of what's driving our dialogue around the master plan and how you have to look at it as you said, Joe, in phases. And what can we achieve in the short term? What then can come somewhere in the middle, and then the aspirational for the long term. But there's the cost that's associated with with all of those phases, need to be taken into consideration, and you have to weigh, is it achievable, is it not, how many stakeholders do you need involved to actually make something like that happen. So it is definitely, it's warranting a lot of our time in our discussion as we look at how do we make this radical welcome, as you discussed a great deal, Greg, for the Navy Yard, and how do we make it physically and emotionally accessible, so that the residents that we are now trying to incorporate to a large degree, we're trying to do 2,800 residential units at the Navy Yard, but how do we make that connection so that this will be a very marketable new neighborhood in the city?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And just to add to that, and I don't want to lose the point around equity when these decisions are made, because we can look at places all around the country, Tulsa, Oklahoma, again, the city of Chester, communities that have been cut off by these major highways. And they've been cut off primarily in minority communities, but this is also a community where in the 95 access corridor does help in terms of, say, the port, right? Easy access to highways and for truck traffic and for industrial use. Like, there is a benefit to having close access to the 95 on-ramps and off-ramps. And so part of it is, how do we make those two communities mix, both the residential beauty of a waterfront mixing with the industrial power that comes with job creation at a port, for example. We also have constituents where the FDR Park is a really incredible space that is now tied into that space, as well as the Stadium District. Hillco is now coming on board, which is the redefinition of the refinery, right? And that's 1,300 acres. And it's all now coming into this one location about how are we dealing with this transportation node? And what are the implications of all of these changes that bring equity, bring access, bring job growth, bring safety? And really, safety becomes a really big factor of this. How do we safely traverse these spaces with a number of different modalities?
Yeah, that's great, Greg. And just to add on to that, I mean, when we think about the waterfront, what makes it attractive for someone to get here through all those barriers that you just discussed, Greg, right? And that also goes to equity and access. But what we had found was you have to make a place, right? So you have to make this place, and this place is reflective of the communities that want to come to it. So a lot of the early starts, Leslie, to what you were talking about, like, what's that first action, and is that first action economical, and can you finance it? Can you do it? So when you think about that, you think about programming and placemaking, and really starting a marketing campaign around, can you see yourself here? Do you want to enjoy this unbelievable resource that is the Delaware River? And really, we're just stewards of that for the wider communities that want to access that resource. So can you create a place that tips enough momentum that you start to solve for infrastructure, and solve for transportation and solve for connectivity? But the first step in that is, can you see yourself in this space? Will you please come here? Will you please enjoy yourself here? And once you have that critical momentum behind you, I think the rest, although expensive, is still solvable into the future.
Yeah, I think, just to add to your point, the better you are at creating this great public realm, the better you are at getting investment to follow it, right? And particularly public investment. And so that's really what we've been thinking about.
Greg, a key to our master plan, it's built on the public realm, a park every half mile,
right?
Connector streets over under I-95, a trail that connects the spine of that, running north and south. But then the logic behind that is, how do you drive private investment then to that area? And our thought was that public realm, that access, the programming, the park space, ultimately unlocks the value for private investors to come in and invest within
Right,
the area.
right,
It's kind of a theory that we've had, and fingers crossed that it's still working. It seems to be.
No, it makes sense though. It makes sense because the public realm is taking the risk first, right? And you're creating what private investment would see as a barrier. And if you're starting to eliminate that for us and creating that situation and those parameters that now may work for that private investment to come in, it starts to make more sense. But it often does take the public realm stepping up and kind of creating the table for everyone to come and now dine together and figure it out. So,
and the thing that private developers least want to pay for is public infrastructure, right? So,
that's right.
You can't charge rent, right?
Exactly.
It's funny when
it's hard to make those numbers work.
Not to dominate this, but anecdotally, we didn't own any of the trail setback when we first started work on the riverfront. And so we had to speak to all the private owners and landowners about acquiring a riverfront setback from them so that we could construct the trail there. And that was a scraping together of wonderful funding sources and partners like the foundations and the Commonwealth and Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. But when we first started that, we had plenty of time to think about it, and some of the landowners here were just that. They were owners, not necessarily developers. So they had a piece of land. It was a post-industrial piece of land. And so we managed to acquire a decent amount of that trail setback. And then we had a couple of years to think about, hey, we're going to design this and we're going to build it and it's going to be a great connection point. Fast forward to today, thankfully, with the success that we've had, we have the pressure coming from the other side. And I find myself telling some of the landowners who are now developers, hey, give me a minute to get the funding together. I know you want to get the trail, and we really wanted to guarantee access for the community there. And so we don't have gated communities. But, it seems that, the more you invest, the more the private market catches up with you.
Yep.
That's true.
That's true. Speaking to that equity portion that we were talking about a few minutes ago, the one thing that I think is interesting about the development along the Delaware and the Navy Yard in particular is that in the coming years and decade, is that essentially both your groups are going to be creating new neighborhoods in Philadelphia. And what I wanted to sort of get at was what responsibility, what are the sort of responsibilities that are inherent in that from your perspective, especially in terms of housing? Where do you, what is your thinking on that in terms of, that it is a real responsibility to think about how do we thoughtfully house folks who are going to be here and still make the city feel comfortable being in essentially entirely new neighborhoods?
I think that, and I wouldn't focus on housing, frankly. I think one of the problems is that we limit it to housing.
Okay.
And when we think about when Leslie and I created the company, and just going back to kind of our proof of concepts that got us to the Navy Yard, we've always focused on how are we creating wealth in communities, particularly for those who have been marginalized. And the housing equation is one, but there's so many other problems that we need to solve in Philadelphia, given the fact that we have a 25% poverty rate that have something to do with housing, but housing is just a component of it. It's really about how are we creating job opportunities? How are we creating business opportunities? How are we creating investment opportunities? How are we creating opportunities for the end user to be equitable? And then in addition to that, how are we making income scales available so that people of all incomes can live in these neighborhoods, so that we're neither concentrating poverty nor wealth to the detriment of the public? And that's really how we've thought about all of our programs that we've developed to date. And that's the approach that our team, globally, our team, Ensemble Mosaic, is taking on the Navy Yard. We're looking at every element of what we do and asking the equity question and solving for that in all phases of our work.
Yeah.
And
in addition, just also being very intentional in how we try to structure opportunities, because Greg is right. It's about jobs. It's about small businesses being able to have the opportunity to grow, and as they grow, they're employing more people, and we're making sure that companies that have not really had access to these opportunities, and something as with such a long time frame of being able to derive work. This is a 15-year process down at the Navy Yard. So we talk often about this is how we can bring smaller businesses in and help them grow through that 15-year process. And we've seen through our projects, if you're able to do that, they will then hire more people, and these, minority MBE and WBE companies will provide more opportunities for people that have not really had that. And then it's a whole ecosystem that's starting to be created, and then everyone starts to win. But what we've learned is that you have to be very intentional in the approach, and a lot of it does start with who the development team is. And I'm really proud to be a part of the Ensemble Mosaic PIDC team at the Navy Yard, because it is in the forefront of everyone's mind. And I see it in every conversation that we have. It's right there on the top of our lips and right on the tip of our tongue, that this is everything revolves around this at the Navy Yard. And if we don't achieve our goals, it'll be actually a failure for us as a team. Not just in place, but also emotionally. So it gives me comfort that we are working in a space like that, where what we are trying to do in regards to diversity and inclusiveness is really a tenet, and it wraps around our entire team. So and a lot of people have said to Greg and I, well, this is a different type of project for you, because you've really focused on inner neighborhoods, marginalized. And when you go down to the Navy Yard, I mean, I am in amazement every time I go down how beautiful it is, right? And how we have such a great platform to be able to jump off of at the Navy Yard. But it's more important for us to be involved in a project like this, so that we're pressing this and pushing this and making sure it is at the top of mind for everyone, that this has got to be a new neighborhood where everyone feels that they can be there, that it's inclusive, and it's welcoming, and a comfortable place to come, because that's important also.
Yeah, I would just
Go ahead,
echo
Jeff.
that, Leslie, and say that you said a word there, intentional. It has to be, the efforts here have to be intentional. And for DRWC, it's slightly different in that, like, we're kind of like an organizing organization. So we don't own all of the land, we own some of it, but we also are a resource to other developers that are coming on the waterfront, that are trying to follow the master plan. And so for us as an organization, we started with the master plan, and we have a whole chapter on wealth building, Greg, and that was a word that you used. So, wealth building within the waterfront being a priority from the start of any development, whether that development is public realm, public space, or whether that development is a private development or a commercial development, like residential or commercial on the waterfront. How do you think about wealth building? And we kind of pull that apart in a couple different ways here. One is our, as DRWC, we have an organizational economic opportunity plan. And we get to sit down and we get to talk about that. And what are the aspirational goals here for the organization? How do we hire services? How do we bring folks along here to make sure that it's equitable for all of Philadelphia? How do we spend money within Philadelphia itself to make sure that Philadelphia is benefiting from that? But more than that, we put then goals on the outside resources. So whether we have a park space that is an activated park, like Blue Cross River Rink Winterfest, or Cherry Street Pier, or Spruce Street Harbor Park, these parks look to cultural entrepreneurship, or the creative and cultural economy within Philadelphia. So like 14 artists in residence that were disadvantaged artists before in Cherry Street Pier, that get to learn from a cohort and grow together, graduate from that program and open that space up to someone else to come in through the different market programs that we run here. And that thread then runs through development. And we have to set goals to say, in order to build wealth, we need people of all Philadelphia to be here, investing here. We need disadvantaged people that aren't usually accessing a capital market in a certain way, to have an opportunity to have a discussion with a private developer that's coming in. So we can do that on land that we own. On land that we don't own, we work through the zoning code. And so this portion of the river, the 6 miles that DRWC is responsible for, we have something called the Central Delaware Overlay that is part of Philadelphia's zoning code. And within that code, in order to build here, and you want to go above a certain height, above 86 feet, you have to choose a bonus. And the highest bonus, Brad, to your question, is affordable housing. How are you going to accommodate affordable housing here? And that will return for a developer a certain amount of density within a project. Or how are you going to connect to transit is another very important bonus within that overlay. How are you going to provide open space and opportunity for the public here? And we like to see that kind of plan come forth through all of it. So it is the most critically important aspect of successful development, in my opinion, on the waterfront or within Philadelphia, how you tackle inclusivity, affordability, and a real community. And we at least have a shot at helping to aid that along on the waterfront.
That's great. Right. If I could just offer a comment to that, because Joe, I agree with you, but I have dealt with the realities of that, right? And the realities of those bonuses are that people buy out of them. And they'll accept the bonus, but they also have an option to pay the city money in lieu of providing affordable housing. And in most cases, that's what they do. And so the other issue that I have is on the development side. We believe that, and we've worked with many developers, we have many partnerships with developers, that we do need a different community of people, not who just have a seat at the table, but who are decision makers at the table, because the decisions that are made about development have not been equitable in the city of Philadelphia. And Leslie made she constituted the term minorities or MBEs, and every time I hear it, it kind of grades on me, because in Philadelphia, Black and brown people are not minorities. Mm-hmm. They're the majority of the city. They're only minorities when it comes to wealth building. So they have fewer opportunities to own anything. They're at the bottom of the rung in terms of job creation, the bottom of the rung in terms of entrepreneurship, bottom of the rung in terms of wealth. Everywhere else, they're majorities. Right? So let's deal with it for what it is. Like, there's one area where we continue to struggle, and it's in wealth. So let's fix that problem.
All right, we have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to ask probably the toughest question, which is for two groups whose projects are along the water. How do you think about climate change? How do you think about the work that you're doing 10 years from now, 40 years from now, 100 years from now?
It's real.
It's real. It's scary.
You just had a flood a week ago on the
Joe,
Delaware River.
Joe, I was running through Penn Treaty Park the other day and saw some of the overflow that had come up onto the trail, and I was like, oh, that's another question I need to ask.
I was waiting for that.
Yeah.
If you look at the models, and the models that are coming from the water department, if you look at what the Philadelphia Water Department has to deal with as a result of climate change, dealing with sewers and impervious space in Philadelphia, and the pressure that it's putting on the system in Philadelphia, it's actually eye-opening. And it's frankly something that every Philadelphian should be paying attention to when we start thinking about land planning and whether we should be building, more density, more impervious spaces, and the effect that it's having on all of the climate. Now, as you get down to the waterfront, we know that gravity takes its place, so all water runs down toward us. Right. And so we have a great land planner. Our master planner is James Cornerfield Operations, well-known, renowned planner. And we have been at the Navy Yard, even before Leslie and I had gotten involved, they've been looking at resiliency and sustainability for all of the time that they've built their buildings. With our next phase, that's a central component of our design strategy for the next 50 to 100 years, and how we're planning for it today to be able to address climate change as it's coming, because it is coming. What people don't realize is it's coming faster than what had ever been modeled before. I think that's it. It's the pace at which it's coming that's most alarming.
Yeah, yeah. And Greg, to say it's real, the 4 highest tides on the Delaware River, 2 were in 2012 associated with Sandy. The highest was actually 2012 with Superstorm Sandy. The one hanging in there is still 1950, but the 4th highest is a storm that just passed last week, where the tide reached over 10 feet on the Delaware River, which causes amazing inundation, especially in the center section here from about Walnut Street up to Kettle Hill Street. It's one of the lowest lying areas, and the storm, Greg, where you were saying the water department, they can't handle the volume that's coming in, and everything's coming through the river. So 1, it is real. 2, I'll go back to something we were talking about earlier, which is incremental improvement into a system. And so I don't think there's, we're not going to snap our fingers and say, we solved climate change, or we solved flooding on the Delaware River because the storms are more frequent than they are now. But we can take small steps, I think, to address it, whether it's, with green building. So we have something here called the waterfront setback, which sets back all development at least 50 feet from the hard edge of a bulkheaded or riprap edge on the river, which allows at least the inundation to take place within that first 50 feet.
First 50.
And then we have a couple test areas here. One that we have in this moving into construction document now is called our South Wetlands Park. And we're looking at taking some of, I'll say, the piers, the former shipping piers that are returning to nature, I like to say, in the South Philadelphia area, and experiment with them for coastal resiliency. So can we take this area and create or engineer a wetlands that would act as a buffer area for coastal resiliency? And then can that model be replicated along a shoreline to provide a buffer area and a vegetated area that would take some of that inundation that is coming? The rest, Greg, though, you're right. It's just, you have to pay attention to the flood zones. You have to be careful with how close the development is actually getting to the river and the height needed, or do you accommodate a flood? Sometimes you get that storm where you just say, we have to plan to accommodate.
Right. You create a space where it happens, right? You let it come. I think the other point is that it needs to be managed really kind of north of the waterfront.
Yeah.
So if we think about, and I'll just mention that the number of impervious spaces that exist in Philadelphia is substantial. We may need to convert a lot of that space to pervious parks, where we can now maintain groundwater, stormwater at the location when it rains, so that it's not just coming down to the waterfront and flooding out our banks. So I think it's got to be a multi-pronged approach, and it can't just be on the waterfront to solve this.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the one last point I'd like to make is I think it does also take the city to lean in and really look at opportunities to be more robust with like green roof programs. I mean, we've done a lot of examining of that to include that in our projects, but there's a cost implication to that. And I know that there's other places that have more robust programs to help to implement that, because even homeowners, if there was a way and there was a program to try to incorporate that, that would help to, help with the matters as well. So I think we have to all be looking at this, and we talk about, P3s and public-private partnerships, and how do we best utilize them so that we can help situations like this climate change, which we're in already. It's not just coming, it's here, right? And it's just going to continue to worsen. So we need to be looking at how does the city step up also to help developers, help homeowners, to help them to solve some of these problems.
All right, last question, and it'll be a lot easier than the other ones. And that is quickly, what's something else that's going on in the city from a development standpoint or a project standpoint that you guys aren't involved in that you think is exciting and something that's going to benefit the city going forward?
I can't think of anything.
All attention on the river, Greg. All attention on the river.
I think we could think of a lot of them. I mean,
A
there's a
lot.
lot of
I
talk
mean-
about life sciences.
Yeah, I would
that's
say
right.
to Leslie's point, what's happening in cell and gene therapy at Penn and how that is really starting to build the life science economy again, or rebuild it. You know, this was always a big pharma region, pharmaceutical region. A number of major pharmaceutical companies are located in and around the Philadelphia area. But what's happening with cell and gene therapy, I think, should not be taken lightly.
Mhm.
There's a lot of developers that are looking at those spaces. And there's a lot of office holders that are now looking at what to do with their office spaces and hoping that it comes forward. But the research itself and the work is incredibly exciting. And what that can mean for the city of Philadelphia as it comes to fruition from the standpoint of just the actual health benefits that it will bring forward for the future, that's happening here in the city of Philadelphia is pretty significant. And the hope is that we capture those folks and they stay in Philly.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think one other area that I think a lot of talk and a lot of attention is being provided right now is affordable housing. I think what's going to be most important, and I hope that it's not lost in all of the efforts, is that affordability needs to be brought in mixed income projects and focus. Like Greg said earlier, to not concentrate poverty, not to concentrate all affordability together, that it really does need to be a mixed income approach. And I'm just hoping a lot of attention is here with affordability, and that's very, very important. And there needs to be money being put behind it, but it needs to be really thoughtfully done so that it's incorporated into projects where it's mixed income and mixed use, because we've seen a lot of benefits in tackling the challenges in that way, so that you are not concentrating issues, but you're creating jobs for the mixed use portion of it, and then you're mixing the income bases, which we think is a benefit to everyone involved in those kind of projects.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today. For more conversations, join us all week at noon and 4 o'clock for more ThinkFest talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. Thanks, Greg.
All
Thanks,
right.
Joe. Pleasure.